Hi everyone, happy Sunday. I don't know if you guys are aware of this or not, but we're getting ready to move into the season of Lent, which brings us up to the season of Easter, which is one of the great celebrations and holidays for us every year in the Christian calendar and Christian tradition. But there's some things we need to know and understand before we get to Easter, just like things we need to understand before we get to Christmas every year. I'm sure there have been times when you may have shared your food with somebody at lunchtime, or you saw somebody new at school and that person maybe looked sad, and so you shared a toy to kind of cheer that person up. Or you may have given money in Sunday school, or you may have seen your parents give money to the church. And every time you're doing that, you're doing something that's called a sacrifice. And it may not seem like a big deal because you just think you're being nice. But anytime you give something that was yours, that was special, important to you, to make somebody else feel better or happy to have in their life, then that's a sacrifice. And that's one of the things that God wants us to do as we're serving Him. And so I want to think about that idea a little bit about how this idea about sacrifice has been around for a long time. And we knew about Jesus long before the Bible story that we talked about back in December, because God has set up the message for us all the way back in the Old Testament. So it's a really interesting story. So I want you guys to think about that a little bit today, how we knew that Jesus was coming and how Easter was going to come to be a way of rescue and salvation for all of us.
God's story, preparing for Jesus. So part of God's story is about how He prepared us for Jesus, and it begins like this. Remember when God created a perfect garden? He then created a perfect family, Adam and Eve, to live in the garden with Him forever. He trusted them with life as long as they obeyed one rule. Unfortunately, Adam and Eve didn't trust God, and they disobeyed. Now Adam, Eve, everyone would have to die, separating us from God forever. This made God very sad. But He had a plan. He knew that He could still save His people through a great rescue. Jesus. Jesus was a big deal. And just like any big deal, people had to get ready for Him. It's like before a big movie comes out, you watch the previews so you know what's coming. Well, Jesus was such a big deal that His previews started thousands of years before He came. The first preview is about a man named Abraham. God promised to make Abraham the father of God's special family. God gave Abraham one special son to start the family, Isaac. Now Abraham knew that one day he would have to die because of what happened in the garden. Every time Abraham did something wrong, God could have said, okay, because you've done this bad thing, you now have to die. But He didn't. Instead, God said, how about killing a lamb instead? It can die so you don't have to. Thank you, said Abraham. But one day, God asked Abraham to do something different. God said, okay, because you've done this bad thing, your son Isaac has to die. This made Abraham very sad. But he decided to trust Him anyway, even though this meant that he would never have the giant family God had promised. When Isaac asked where the sacrifice was, Abraham said, God will provide it. And guess what? He did! A ram died so Isaac didn't have to. The second preview happened hundreds of years later. Abraham's family, the Israelites, had gotten huge, but they were stuck as slaves in Egypt under a mean king called Pharaoh. He would not let the Israelites leave, so God said, okay, because Pharaoh has done this bad thing, every firstborn son in the land of Egypt has to die. The bad news was this meant that the Israelite sons would have to die along with the Egyptian sons. But the good news was God, once again, created a rescue plan. God said, anyone who kills a lamb and paints the blood on their door will be saved. The destroyer will pass over your house. The lambs died so the sons didn't have to. Over and over again, when there was trouble, God sent a sheep to die so His people didn't have to. Until finally, God revealed His final rescue plan. The previews were over. It was time for the feature presentation. At last, Jesus, the rescuer, came. He lived on earth just like us, but then He died to take away the punishment we deserved. Jesus died so we don't have to. But guess what else? Jesus didn't stay dead like the sheep. He came back to life and went up to heaven. Now we can be close to God again. And one day, He'll recreate a perfect world for God's whole family to live in forever. Just like the original garden, but better. And that's the story of how God prepared us for Jesus. So in case you missed it, here's the quick version. Death separated us from God. God planned a great rescue. He gave us previews. A ram died so Isaac didn't have to. Lambs died so the Israelite sons didn't have to. Finally, Jesus died so we don't have to. But Jesus came back to life. Now death can't separate us from God. And that's a part of God's story.
So that is one of the great parts of the story of Jesus, is that he came here to offer us that opportunity to become Christians. And so one of our verses to think about is from 1 Peter 5:6, and it says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time." And this is a part of the Lent season, as we're working our way towards the death and resurrection of Jesus, which leads to salvation for all of us. Is this time for us to kind of stop and think and reflect on how we're living our lives and our relationship with God, which is what Lent kind of brings us to. And so, how do we do that? We can do that through reading our Bible, being a part of church services. We can do that through prayer and talking with God, and even this idea of reflection. That means we stop and kind of think about, so what have we been doing for God? How are we serving Him? Are there things that we could do differently to let Him know how much we do love Him? That's all part of this idea of coming into Lent. Kind of think about that with our song for today.
Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight. Trust Him, for He will guide you. Trust Him, let Him live inside you. He will lift you in the darkest night and lead you into the light. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight. Trust Him, for He will guide you. Trust Him, let Him live inside you. He will lift you in the darkest night and lead you into the light. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight. Trust Him, for He will guide you. Trust Him, let Him live inside you. He will lift you in the darkest night and lead you into the light. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight.
So if you guys can take that message with you, but as we move into this time of reflection and thinking about all that God has done for us in His sacrifice, and we'll talk more about that as we closer to Easter, just do remember that you trust in God and He's going to be there to take care of you each step of the way. We kind of close out with Psalms 33, 20 through 22. We put our hope in the Lord. He is our help and our shield. In Him our hearts rejoice, for we trust in His holy name. Let your unfailing love surround us, Lord, for our hope is in you alone. That's one of the great things about the Easter story, is that we always have hope through God. You guys have a great week. Goodbye.